Uh, Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to welcome all of you to the second edition of our webinar series, Conversations on Constitutional Design. First, let me introduce myself. To those of you who don't know me, my name is Yonatan Fessha. I'm a professor of law at the University of the Western Cape and currently the holder of the UWC Research Chair on Constitutional Design for Divided Societies. So in conversations on constitutional design, we discuss the relevance and effectiveness of constitutional design in the management of divided societies. We'll look at the use and limitations of constitutional design in its contribution to the peaceful management of divided societies. And with African states and their constitutions as our primary focus, we invite scholars that analyze the various options, problems, and challenges that constitution makers face in reordering the states in a context of a very deeply polarized society. Today, we are joined by Professor Rotimi Suberu, all the way from Vermont in the United States of America. Just to say a few words about our guest speaker, Professor Rotimi Suberu currently teaches politics and international relations at Bennington College, Vermont, USA. Previously, he taught political science at the University of Ibadan, Nigeria, where he obtained his PhD in 1990. His main research interests are in the areas of democratization, the management of ethnic and religious conflicts, and Nigerian government and politics. His publications include a book on federalism and ethnic conflicts in Nigeria, and several book chapters and journal articles. And he has served as a consultant to the Nigerian government, the World Bank, and also to the National Endowment for Democracy, as well as Freedom House and the Forum of Federations. And he has won fellowships and visiting positions at a number of prominent universities, including the University of Oxford. So with these few words, I will just mention that Professor Suberu has 30 minutes to make his presentations. After that, we will have 30 minutes for questions and comments. And with these words, it's now my great pleasure to hand over the virtual floor to Professor Suberu. So Professor Suberu, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yonatan. Yeah, I'm delighted, to participate in this seminar, and I hope that you've seen and had time to look at the paper on which this presentation is based. So the paper basically looks at what in Nigeria we call the federal character principle, and it's simply a constitutional principle that states that the composition and conduct of governmental agencies, both national and subnational, should reflect the federal or the diverse or the plural character and composition of the country. So it's a basic principle of representation and recognition of the diversity in Nigeria. And some have argued that this principle is one of the largest affirmative action programs in the world. And others have said that it is the single most important concept in Nigerian public life. And what I find interesting in this principle is that when you analyze it carefully, it seems to span the various approaches that scholars have developed for managing ethnic conflicts. So it's quintessentially hybrid, in my view, in that it combines so many components. So in terms of the comparative scholarship on managing what is often called horizontal inequality, by horizontal inequality, we mean group-based inequality or ethnic-based inequality. So in terms of that, inequality, scholars have argued that there are three basic ways by which this kind of inequality or disparity or diversity can be managed. One is where you have very direct policies that are targeted at addressing issues of ethnic anxiety, ethnic inequality. And by direct, you mean things like ethnic federalism. I think Ethiopia is a classic African example of that, where you deliberately recognize ethnic communities. But then there are other policies that can be called integrative. These are policies that are designed not really to recognize ethnic identities, but in a way to moderate them and to encourage people to basically come together rather than existing in their separate ethnic cocoons. And an example of that is, Nigeria is often cited by Horowitz, a scholar which many of you may be familiar with, as an example of integration. In other words, you are basically doing things like banning ethnic parties, or more in a more sophisticated manner, applying what is called geographic voting spread requirement. So in Nigeria, for instance, to be the president of the country, you have to win a quarter of the votes in 2/3 of the states in the federation. That means you have to be an ethnic moderate. You have to appeal to diverse ethnic constituencies. This policy has been adopted in a place like Kenya, where I think to win the presidency, you have to win a quarter of the votes in more than half of the counties. It has also been used in Indonesia. So you have what you may call direct policies of ethnic conflict management. You have the integrative policies, and then you have what is also called the indirect. These are policies that are not, ethnically based, but because of their design, in a way, they help to reassure ethnic minorities and reduce ethnic insecurity. So you think like things like a constitutional court, a professional constitutional court that basically arbitrate disputes between groups. You think like things like human rights provisions, that guarantee that every individual, no matter their ethnic belonging, has certain inviolable rights, that cannot be violated. Or you think about independent commissions, or a ban, as we have in Nigeria, on the adoption of any religion as a state religion. So my argument is that the federal character principle, in a way, spans all of these elements, all of these approaches for managing ethnic conflict. And that's why I think the principle is very unique. In terms of the structure of the paper, since many of you have read it, and since I may not have time to cover all aspects of the paper, I'll just highlight the way the paper is structured. One, I try to identify the constellations, the configurations of ethnic diversity that have made, that have basically produced the federal character principle in Nigeria as a mechanism for managing ethnic diversity, ethnic inequality, or ethnic conflict. And I know Nigeria, many African countries are diverse. You talk about a country like Ethiopia, with over 80 ethnic groups, some of them with a history of ethnic liberation movements, I'll talk about Kenya with the Kikuyus, the Luo, the Luyas, and so on and so forth. But I think Nigeria is really one of the most problematic in terms of its diversity, in the sense that, the country, apart from having, major and minor ethnic groups, apart from being equally divided between Christian and Muslims, also has this very historic division between the North and South. And as I argue in the paper, that division is particularly problematic because the North is demographically and politically advantaged, but it is socioeconomically disadvantaged. Then the South is, politically and demographically disadvantaged, but it is economically advantaged. So you have this constant tension between a politically dominant North and an economically dominant South. And one of our scholars, Professor Isawa Elagu, says it is a contest between the tyranny of numbers and the tyranny of skills, basically. So you have that as a basic foundation for the federal character policy in Nigeria. The other section of the paper focuses on how the federal character principle has basically evolved in Nigeria, how it has come to encompass this multifaceted or hybrid approach to managing ethnic conflict. So in the paper, I basically traced the history of the evolution of the federal character principle. I think Nigeria started primarily with a direct approach to managing ethnic conflict. So we focused on what you might call a consociational approach, where we created a federation of 3 major regions, each of the regions representing the major ethnic groups in Nigeria. So you have the Hausa Fulani in the north, you have the Yoruba, I am Yoruba myself, in the west, and you have the Igbos in the east. And we basically created a 3-unit ethnic federation, empowering each of these major ethnic groups. We also did several other things. We gave the regions enormous powers. They had constitutions of their own. They basically got, we apply what is called the derivation principle, whereby, in terms of revenue allocation, whereby basically units got rewarded in terms of revenue allocation on the basis of what they actually, contributed to the national pool. So it's called derivation in the sense that you basically get what is derived from your economic activity. One of the things about this federal system was that the regions also actually had quasi-diplomatic representation in London as a way of just showing how Nigeria was so almost like the Ethiopian system, whereby the regions, at least formally, are given the right of secession. They are given enormous powers. And we applied that principle in the initial years of the federation. But that didn't work for many reasons. One of which was that one of the regions was bigger than the other regions combined. And, I think very obviously, if you have a federation that is based on only 3 regions, it is likely to be highly centrifugal, it's likely to be highly unstable, unlike when you have a federation that is based on multiple units. So, that federal system did not work, even though it was based on direct or on a consociational formula of recognizing and empowering the major ethnic groups in the country. The system did not work. It led to a civil war. And from that experience of civil war from 1967 to 1970, in which over 1 million people perished, one of the largest civil wars of the 20th century, Nigeria decided to adopt another approach to managing ethnic conflict. And that was actually when the federal character principle came into use. Basically, what we did under the 1979 Constitution, which I describe as the second phase of the implementation of the federal character in Nigeria, is that we created a presidential system of government, and we banned ethnic parties, and we projected the president as a kind of pan-ethnic or trans-ethnic figure who is going to basically unite the country. And so we introduced that famous principle that I already alluded to, which basically says that the president should be elected in a way that reflects the federal character of the country, the diversity of the country. In other words, according to the Constitution, the president must win 1/4 of the votes in at least 2/3 of the states in the federation, which means that it cannot afford to be an ethnic champion, at least in theory. He has to appeal across broad ethnic constituencies. And of course, federal character had other elements, but to me, that was the most important. Having a president who is elected in such a way as to reflect the diversity of the country. Of course, in his cabinet, he had to appoint at least an indigene of each state in his cabinet. So Nigeria has 36 states. So by law, the Nigerian cabinet must at least include 36 ministers, each representing the states of the federation. But even that was not sufficient enough to ensure ethnic peace and ethnic stability. The Second Republic, on which that principle, that presidential principle was based, collapsed basically after 4 years. It lasted from 1979 to 1983. But one thing, scholars like Larry Diamond and others and Horowitz have noted this. One thing about that experiment was that although the democratic system was not stable, it collapsed after 4 years, it was less ethnically polarized, it was less ethnically turbulent than the period of the first phase of federal character when we implemented a direct or constitutional approach. So to the credit of that republic, it was less ethnically divided or ethnically polarized. It basically collapsed more as a result of corruption than as a result of polarizing ethnic conflicts. So basically, we then went to the third aspect of the federal character principle is when we decided to establish what was called a federal character commission as an independent commission to basically articulate and enforce principles by which ethnic equality and ethnic peace can be promoted in the federation. And I want to, emphasize this point about indirect principles of ethnic conflict management. As I already noted, it involves things like guaranteeing human rights, establishing independent constitutional courts that can arbitrate inter-ethnic conflicts, prohibiting the use of a state religion, entrenching the constitution so that it cannot be amended by a simple majority. All of this help to protect minorities, even though they are not explicitly targeted at ethnicity. They are basically human rights provisions, rule of law provisions, and so on and so forth. So in the case of Nigeria, we established the Federal Character Commission along with several other independent commissions that are supposed to be very neutral and that are supposed to basically arbitrate intergovernmental and intergroup conflicts. So that's why I call the establishment of the Federal Character Commission as an independent body that is not subject to partisan influence as a kind of indirect approach to ethnic conflict management, in that it is based on this principle of basically establishing independent institutions, independent oversight agencies that can restrain the abuse of political power. But as I note in my paper, that Federal Character Commission, like many other commissions, so you have, not just the Federal Character Commission, you have the Electoral Commission, you have the Revenue Allocation Commission, you have the Anti-Corruption Commission. But the tragedy in Nigeria, which I think is familiar to many other, is that many of these commissions, even though they are called independent, and they actually have independent written into their names, are actually very dependent on the presidency. They can be manipulated by the presidency. And so in the case of Nigeria, for instance, the Federal Character Commission is appointed by the president, although it's supposed to be, confirmed by the Senate, and it's supposed to be independent in its operations, but it is appointed by the president, and it is basically controlled by the president. And as I noted in the paper, one of the things that has happened with the Federal Character Commission in Nigeria is that it has basically said it doesn't have any power or any inclination to correct or to scrutinize or to check the abuses of federal character principle by the Nigerian president. For those of you who follow Nigerian affairs, one of the serious criticisms of the current president in Nigeria, who is Northern Hausa Fulani Muslim, is that he's so parochial, that you look at his most important political appointments, including security appointments and strategic ministries. They are basically people from his own part of the country. But the Federal Character Commission, as an independent commission, has not been able to regulate or even to critique that, in spite of its mandate to enforce equitable sharing of political positions. So basically, my argument is that, the federal character principle is designed to span all of these three elements of ethnic conflict management, direct or consociational, integrative, and indirect. And I think, in my view, it has done well in terms of serving as a principle of ethnic consociation, that is the direct aspect, and ethnic integration. But what is fundamentally problematic about the federal character in Nigeria is that you still have these deficits in accountability and oversight, that have basically undermined the effectiveness of the federal character principle as a mechanism for managing ethnic conflict. So I think, I'm getting to the end of the presentation now. Basically, the third part of the paper looks at, assesses the federal character. How has it fared in practice as a mechanism for managing ethnic conflict? And my conclusion, my assessment is that the federal character, in spite of all I've said, has in a way functioned to moderate political and bureaucratic inequality. So when you look at the Nigerian bureaucracy today, you find that it's much more equal. It is much more equally spread among ethnic groups than, say, in the past. It doesn't really reflect the kind of educational disadvantage between the North and the South, in that in the typical bureaucracy, especially at the highest level, you have this principle of representing the states equally. So for the position of permanent secretaries, there's a commitment to ensuring that this is equitably spread among the states of the Federation. As I already noted, even though the president may be very parochial, he is constitutionally bound to select a minister from each state of the Federation. Although, he might then allocate the most strategic positions like defense, internal affairs, or, Attorney General of the Federation, and so on and so forth, to people from his own part of the country, but is at least obliged constitutionally to appoint a minister from each state of the Federation. So what I say is that ethnic, in terms of political and bureaucratic inclusion, the federal character principle has helped to advance that. And for those of you who follow Nigeria, there's also in Nigeria this informal principle of rotation, which is inspired by the federal. And the federal character principle doesn't say that if the president comes from the North, the vice president should come from the South. If the president is a Muslim, the vice president should be a Christian, or that after 8 years of a president in the North, he should be succeeded by a Southerner. No, the constitution doesn't state that. But Nigerian politicians have informally, inspired by the federal character principle, have come to implement some of these principles, whereby, the presidency is not only balanced between North and South in terms of the presidential and vice presidential ticket, but it's also rotated, around sections of the country. So for me, that's an important achievement of the federal character principle. I also argue that the federal character principle has basically promoted a broad commitment to Nigeria's multinational unity. And I think this is important because, again, I've been reading a lot, and Yonatan, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I've been reading a lot about Ethiopia because of the current crisis, but you get the sense that in countries like Ethiopia, there is what you might call a credible secessionist movement. And I may be wrong. But in Nigeria, there are secessionist movements, no doubt, in the, especially in the southeastern part of the country. But I don't see these secessionist movements as credible or viable, in the sense that the major elites in the Southeast and in other parts of the country they see a lot that is wrong with the country, but they do not want to secede from it. They actually see the federal character, if properly implemented, as providing an opportunity for inclusion. And to me, this is one of the achievements of the federal character, especially for a country like Nigeria, where we've also had a history of credible secession and warfare. In Nigeria today, unlike say in Sudan, the old Sudan, where the South basically had to secede because it really never felt it could be equitably incorporated into the Republic of Sudan. It felt that this was a country that was going to be dominated constantly by the North. So Nigeria, in my view, has secessionist movement, but they are not credible. They are not viable. Partly, in my view, because the federal character at least guarantees that all groups will be included. Another aspect of the achievement of the federal character is that it has promoted this broad commitment to power sharing in all aspects of national life. Even, Nigerians, as many of you now, many Africans are soccer crazy, when you look at the Nigerian Football Association, I mean, you would think this is something that has nothing to do with ethnicity, but there's almost a commitment in the administration of the soccer federation that if you have a chairman of the federation, serving a term from the North, after that, it should be succeeded by a Southerner, So you have this broad commitment, even, to power sharing. Even in the Nigerian Bar Association, it is the biggest professional association in Nigeria. They basically rotate their chairmanship and other key positions between the North, the East, and the West, So there is this broad commitment that the federal character, in my view, has promoted to power sharing. And in terms of Nigerian national identity, I think it's a success of the federal character principle that you have this broad commitment to Nigerian national identity along with ethnic identity. So many argue that one of the earliest indicators of a robust multi-ethnic society is that people have this dual commitment. They equally value their ethnic and their national identities, and they do not see any contradiction in that. So they hold dual identities. And in Nigeria, when you look at things like the Afrobarometer survey, an overwhelming proportion of Nigerians say that they equally value their national and their ethnic identity, which I think is also a reflection of the success of the federal character in basically promoting this idea that you can have unity in diversity. Having said that, my argument is also that the federal character also has very significant shortcomings. And two of them I note in the paper. One is that there's still a lot of ethnic contention and ethnic mobilization in Nigeria. So even, when you talk about presidential elections in Nigeria, there's almost an emphasis on ethnic mobilization and ethnic contention. It's almost like it is not about the competence of the president, it's about where it comes from and whether there is equitable representation. And you see that, and in the universities, it's so, you expect the university to be really, to have these universal norms of meritocracy. But in many of Nigeria's universities today, you see these terrible conflicts among indigenes over who should be the vice chancellor, who is promoted as a professor, and it can become so, so ridiculous and so disturbing in that you find this high level of ethnic polarization, ethnic mobilization, and ethnic contention, and basically ethnicization of public affairs. So that has been a major challenge with the federal character principle. The other major challenge with the federal character principle is that it has actually not addressed mass-based socioeconomic horizontal inequality. So as I said, in terms of political and bureaucratic inclusion, the federal character has been successful. But when you look at things like access to electricity, health, education, literacy, income, you still find this North-South division in Nigeria. You know, the North is still economically and educationally disadvantaged compared to the South. And that is why it also has a lot of these insurgencies, you know, Islamist insurgencies and so on and so forth. So the federal character has not been successful in mitigating that. And you know, to go to the final part of my paper, the debates, the constitutional reform debates that are going on in Nigeria today, in a way try to address some of these challenges, or at least speak to some of these challenges with the federal character principle, with the failure to reduce ethnic contention and ethnic mobilization, and with the failure to reduce this horizontal or group-based economic inequality between the North and South. So one idea has been, you know, to basically strengthen subnational units in the hope that these units, being in control of things like education and basic socioeconomic opportunities, can better address inequality, even though you still need a national government to coordinate and stimulate and encourage all of these policies for reducing economic inequality. But you need the subnational government in things like education, for instance. Primary education and secondary education are subnational responsibilities in Nigeria. But in the North, you have a lot of out-of-school children, you know, at the primary school level. So the argument is really that strengthening the federal system and encouraging the subnational units to respond more proactively to some of these challenges could be a way to address, you know, the kind of inequality you have in things like education or infant mortality between the North and South. Then in terms of ethnic contention, especially around presidential elections, you know, there's been this suggestion that maybe the Nigerian presidency, like presidencies elsewhere in Africa, has been too powerful. And so maybe one way is to shift to a parliamentary system of government, which is more collegiate, you know, or even adopt a Swiss-style presidential council. Some argue that maybe you should actually formally entrench the principle for zoning the presidency, which is still an informal principle in Nigeria, that maybe you could basically ensure that by constitutional law, rather than by just informal convention, the presidency is actually rotated among geopolitical zones. But the proposal that I find most attractive is the proposal that states that, look, the powers of the president should actually be restrained, should be reduced to make it less of a high stakes ethnic competition for power. Which brings me to the third aspect of the federal character principle, which I think has been the most inadequately practiced of that principle, which is basically this indirect approach that emphasizes you know, checks and balances, creating strong oversight commission, entrenching human rights, and so on and so forth. And I really want to make a general observation that in many African countries, part of the problem is actually not the design of the constitution itself, but the implementation, the ability of you know, people in power to subvert the implementation of the constitution, which basically points to the need to empower institutions that can actually enforce the constitution. In other words, oversight mechanisms, regulatory agencies that can actually enforce the constitution. And I see that, I mean, there's a recent article on Indonesia in Publius, the Journal of Federalism, which basically talks about how in Indonesia, in terms of the kind of devolution that has taken place, it has been successful in Aceh, but has not been successful in Papua New Guinea. I hope I'm pronouncing those provinces well. And the argument is that the design of devolution in both provinces has been the same, but the difference has been in implementation and enforcement. And so you really need these indirect institutions, oversight agencies, to actualize what is put in the Constitution in terms of things like the federal character. And so for me, and for many others in Nigeria, the major challenge is to begin to build independent institutions, including the Electoral Commission, for instance, that can basically ensure that what is actually put in the Constitution is actually enforced in practice. So this seems to be the direction or the major direction of constitutional change in Nigeria, whereby we are beginning to look at how oversight institutions, anti-corruption institutions, independent electoral commissions, independent constitutional courts can become more effective and can, help to advance, some of the things that have been put in the Constitution, like the federal character principle in Nigeria. I think I will stop there, and I look forward to, your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rotimi. I think that was very interesting and insightful presentation. I enjoyed reading the paper and equally enjoyed the presentation. So thank you very much. So I will. So we have about 25 minutes or so. So I will open the floor for questions and comments. So the floor is open, and you can also use the chat box. Okay, I think we have, yes, yes, Professor Erk, is Jan Erk. Go ahead, please.
Good to meet you. Sorry, I've read a lot of your work on federalism in Africa, and I use your work regularly, so it's good to see you.
It's a privilege, Professor Suberu, to finally listen to you in person, although it's online. And likewise, I'm a big consumer of your work and a big admirer of your scholarship. And also thanks to Yonatan for organizing this. And I'm at the north of the continent now. I'm in Morocco. And my question, Professor Suberu, is about how every solution creates its second set of problems. And what was designed to manage ethnic diversity and keep the country together has created the perception, especially amongst the young people in Nigeria, that there is an elitist certain oligarchy that seems to have monopolized politics. And the Afrobarometer surveys that you've mentioned indicate very clearly that there is a growing sense of disillusionment amongst the young people. So we see similar things perhaps behind William Ruto's election recently in Kenya and in Lebanon. So I wonder if there is any way that the inherently elitist nature of this compromise between different ethnic groups could be reconciled with some sort of understanding of, especially with modern technology and the youth, that there is perhaps an additional underlying dynamic that goes against this power sharing logic of the last few decades. So that would be something that I reflect on a lot, and I'd love to hear what you think about this. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Prof. Thank you so much. Do you want me to respond immediately or take a couple of questions?
Maybe you can just respond this one, and then the next round we collect.
Yeah, I think, that's an absolutely important point, about the elitist nature of many of these power sharing design. And you are absolutely right. In fact, in terms of the secessionist movements in the Southeast, you could see a clear elite dichotomy. The elites are invested in the Nigerian project. They have power as governors, as legislators, they are represented in the federal bureaucracy. So they are invested in it, but the mass of the people are disenchanted and they are the ones actually pushing for secession, So, and many who have studied, the Southeast have really noted this dichotomy between elite commitment to Nigeria and mass disaffection, because Nigeria has not produced, it's so corrupt. People, almost more than 30% unemployment. There's a sense of hopelessness and joblessness among the youth, and so on and so forth. And, basic infrastructures are not available and so on and so forth. And you are right, even I've been reading a lot about Aaron Leifert, and I remember that in his initial writings, he talked about this elite oligarchy and elite cartel as basically inbuilt into consociationalism. So yes, it's about elite power sharing. And to me, this is why independent institutions are absolutely important, in my view, because some of these independent institutions are also, at least in the Nigerian context, are supposed to be anti-corruption institutions. They are supposed to be a kind of code of conduct bureau that basically ensures that, okay, you are an elite, you are in power, but then you shouldn't be, using public power for private advantage. You should be bound by a set of rules, a set of code of conduct that basically ensures that you are serving the public and not serving private interest. But again, in Nigeria, many of these commissions have been designed almost to fail. And they've been so I see these oversight institutions, I'm not saying it is the only solution, but I see them as, if they are strengthened, if corruption can be curbed by really strong anti-corruption institutions. I think the anti-corruption institutions in Nigeria, they are a joke, They go after the political opposition, they go after the enemies of the president, and I think this is familiar with, but then they protect the presidency. A lot of the reason why public institutions are not working in Nigeria and public services are not provided and economic opportunities are not, is because there's just an incredible, unbelievable amount of corruption. People using public resources blatantly to serve, private ends. And so, strengthening regulatory institutions like the Code of Conduct Bureau and the Anti-Corruption Commission in Nigeria could be a way to ensure that these elites are at least accountable to broader ethnic constituencies, and they deliver, public goods. So in my view, and that's why I also think that the focus on constitutional design in Nigeria and in other countries should be less on, ethnic consociation or ethnic integration, but on these indirect mechanisms that promote the accountability, of people in power to mass-based ethnic constituencies. But that's, it's an absolutely important point you make about just this elite mass gap in Nigeria in terms of their attitudes to the Nigerian project. A lot of the people just feel Nigeria is, in fact, if you read the Nigerian media, they've designed all kinds of words to disparage Nigeria as an entity. They call it a jungle or a zoo or whatever, but the elite are invested, the Ohaneze Undigbo, it is the elite Igbo socio-cultural organization in Nigeria, keeps saying, oh, Nigeria is workable, it's correctable, it can be reformed. But the mass of the people have lost interest because of just this hopelessness and joblessness among the youth. And I see that curbing corruption through strong institutions can be a way to, address this, mass elite gap.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me pose one question, and as the constitutional lawyer in me, taking you back to the issue of constitutional design. So you talk about how this broader commitment to power sharing, to the federal character, and the different elements of power sharing has somehow led to sort of inclusive governments. and has empowered minorities. But at the same time, this same commitment has also entrenched the ethnic divide in any case. It has kept alive the ethnic mobilization. So there is a dilemma here. So how do you sort of circumvent that dilemma, or is it just inherent in the design itself?
I would say, and I think this is a standard observation, that part of the contradiction of policies that are designed to manage ethnicity is that more or less they focus attention on those ethnic identities, and they can make a deeply divided society even more deeply divided, because you are focusing on ethnic identities. But I think the good thing about Nigeria, as I've already indicated, is that it is not only based on the direct recognition of ethnicity. I mean, that's an important aspect of the federal character principle. It also has these other components whereby you are banning ethnic parties, whereby you are saying, okay, the president has to win support from across different segments of the population. And, so I think in a way, as you know, Nigeria has basically, unlike Ethiopia, has broken down the major ethnic groups into multiple states. Some call that as an example of anti-ethnic federalism, rather than ethnic federalism. So I think the good thing about Nigeria is that, yes, you have this mobilization. It's a real future of Nigeria, but it is also in a way constrained or mitigated by this emphasis on national unity, by the fact that, it's so difficult to get the Yorubas to agree on secession because they are split into 6 states. A good example is that when the subnational, the Yoruba states in Nigeria decided to adopt, because Nigeria doesn't have a subnational policing. So some of the states decided, because of fears about these institutions being used to undermine national unity. So some of the states in the Southwest decided to adopt subnational police. But one of the states in Lagos just didn't go along with that because it's a separate state on its own. The same thing with Sharia implementation in northern Nigeria. Not all of the northern states have adopted Sharia, even some of them, and not all of them have adopted Sharia in the same way. They've adopted it in different ways. Sharia is more effectively enforced in some parts of the North. So I think, yeah, you are right. One of the real challenge with, policies for managing ethnic conflict is that they also tend to focus attention on those very divisions that they are trying to contain. But in the case of Nigeria, I think this has been partly mitigated by introducing other policies beyond mere ethnic recognition, by emphasizing integration, for instance, banning ethnic parties, breaking down the major ethnic groups into multiple states. So in a way that has mitigated that challenge, which I think it's real, that ethnic management conflicts, policies for managing ethnic conflict can also highlight the salience of those identities and make a country deeply divided. But as I said, Nigeria has mitigated that by other integrationist policies that in a way emphasize national integration rather than ethnic recognition and accommodation.
Thank you very much. Any other question that we have? Questions, comments?
Question,
yes, Zamalak, Professor Ayala, may proceed.
Hi, Zamalak, good to hear you again.
Hi, Rotimi, great to see you. I'm trying to turn this thing on.
Yeah.
Great to see you again. And I enjoyed the paper. I read it this morning, and the presentation was also really great. Just 2 questions. The first question is there any group in Nigeria which kind of is dismissive of any political articulation of ethnicity and which emphasizes Nigerian national identity, probably even redesigning the federal system in such a way that ethnicity is no longer a factor? Is there any group that promotes that kind of political agenda? If so, if there is any group, is that group also identified with any specific region or ethnic community or something like that? The other on this Federal Character Commission, I was reading somewhere, I don't remember exactly which paper, but there was this criticism that the commission was kind of ethnic auditor, which is interested more in numbers rather than whether or not the holder of a particular position is qualified to hold that position. If you can say something on that. Thank you very much.
Yeah. But, the second question is whether just the criticism of the Federal Character Commission is that it is concerned with just numbers rather than
exactly, yeah.
Okay, yeah, all right. Yeah, okay. Two great questions. When I think you have, and this is so familiar, or maybe not too familiar, you have radical socialist groups, that think, that everything is about class warfare and not about ethnic. And you have, I think when we had a 50-member commission that looked at Nigeria's constitution, you had these two scholars, one from the north, one from the south, radical scholars. I still remember, one is Segun Oshoba, the other is Bala Yusuf, and they basically wrote a minority report saying, look, the constitution is based on, any attempt to recognize ethnicity is bound to be, hopeless, and that the major division in Nigeria is between ethnic groups, that is between class. But that is really a minority opinion. There's also an opportunistic dimension to this debate about recognizing ethnicity or not recognizing ethnicity, which I alluded to in the paper. So when it comes to bureaucratic and educational positions, Southerners argue that, look, everything should be on merit because, of course, they have the advantage. They say, oh, you shouldn't recognize ethnicity. Everything, why should you be, in fact, I alluded to this case of a young girl who went to the courts because she felt she was discriminated against. But that is in education and bureaucracy, where the South has an advantage. And so they argue that, oh, everything should be on merit. You shouldn't be emphasized, because they stand to benefit, in my view. Then when it comes to political position, where the North, because of its numbers, has a greater advantage, then the Northerners argue that, look, it should be by, by democratic merit, you shouldn't. So I see that as very opportunistic, because even though it uses the arguments of universal meritocracy, it is basically designed to advantage specific ethnic constituencies. So in my view, the only principled opposition to ethnic representation are by those radical Marxist scholars and socialist scholars who call themselves progressives, but they are just a minority voice. The reality in Nigeria is that ethnic identities are real and they just have to be accommodated. And we know that even in Ethiopia, the student movement also recognize that ethnicity is a fundamental issue, and that's why they promoted this notion of ethnic federalism. So that's my take on that. With the Federal Character Commission, I just think there are just a lot of, not just the fact that it is focused on the superficial, there are so many problems with that commission. It has not lived up to its expectation. Yes, it looks at numbers, rather than actually the distribution of strategic positions, but it also does so many other things that don't make sense, one of which I already alluded to, the idea that, oh, it's a presidential commission, it doesn't have any right to be looking at whether the president's appointments are equitable or not. It is supposed to take bureaucracies that are flouting the federal character to court, but it doesn't do that. Sometimes it says it doesn't have the resources. Sometimes it relies on the agencies that is overseeing to basically fund its activities. It says it's underfunded. So to go and check whether a commission is actually obeying the federal character or not, it wants that commission or that agency to pay it, to carry out its oversight functions, So it has so many. I think this is really a commission that is really not working as it is supposed to be. And the issue you've identified is only one of many problems, with the Federal Character Commission in Nigeria.
Thank you very much. We got a few more minutes. Any questions? I've got one question. If
I may come in,
I think there's somebody.
Let me not abuse my chair and give it to Tinashe. Okay, please go ahead, Tinashe.
Thank you very much, Chair, for organizing these conversations. I think they are very, very important. And previously, it was very difficult to engage with colleagues from different countries, but now with Zoom, we can do that easily. And secondly, thanks to Prof. Suberu for that presentation. Just one question for me. I think the bigger question there is, how do you use the Constitution and many other institutional arrangements to accommodate diversity? So you can come up with a number of mechanisms and measures that Prof. Suberu has presented on, and also that you, Prof. Fessha, have also written about regarding South Africa and Ethiopia. But the bigger question for me is the issue of tolerance. So you can have these measures or this institutional design in place, but if there is no tolerance among groups, whether ethnic or whether religious, those mechanisms are unlikely to work. So if Prof. Suberu, if you could comment on the issue of tolerance, you have all these measures that you've described. What is the importance of tolerance to ensure that the mechanisms actually bring the fruits to the table? Thank you.
I mean, thank you for that question. I think really the debate is whether, the broader debate, which your question is whether institutional designs matter at all, or whether it's just underlying socioeconomic factors, economic development, or what, And to me, they matter. Institutional design matters. The underlying cultural variables also matter. And maybe they are in fact even more important. But the idea of institutional design is that you can, in a way, structure institutions in such a way as to encourage tolerance and accommodation. By putting it into the Constitution, the issue is how will you enforce that? And that's why, many scholars are putting emphasis on mechanisms that can ensure that the Constitution is enforced. But beyond that, you also need those underlying cultural, economic variables, that promote tolerance, that promote accommodation, like, commit a political culture that values the rule of law. Many will say the underlying structural variable is economic development. Where you have high levels of economic development, you also tend to have high levels of economic security, and also less emphasis on, say, xenophobia or intolerance. At the same time, while recognizing the importance of cultural or structural factors, I think it's a mistake to just dismiss, as many people do, to just say, oh, institutions don't matter. When you design, Nigeria has shown that, and many other countries have shown that when you design institutions to recognize or to incentivize ethnic toleration and moderation, they can be effective. For instance, we've seen this in Nigeria, that even if you are very parochial, the moment you want to contest for the presidency of Nigeria, at least you have to pretend to be national in character, because you cannot win the support. You can't win the presidency unless you go outside your ethnic cocoon and appear moderate. Of course, the elections can be rigged, which goes back to the question of how you ensure that electoral institutions actually operate as they are supposed to operate, that they are truly independent. But there is no doubt that when you put it into the condition that, look, a president to win support has to obtain electoral, a significant level of electoral support from across different ethnic groups, that by nature they tend to be more moderate because the incentives have been built into the institutional design to encourage that level of moderation and toleration. So to answer your question, Tinashe, I would say those underlying structural and cultural factors matter a lot. Economic development matters, public education to promote toleration matters, but also institutions matter. Institutions can be designed in such a way as to incentivize toleration, ethnic toleration, and accommodation.
Thank you very much. I see a hand. Rotimi, are you okay? Can we?
Oh, yes, I'm okay. Yeah, I'm okay.
Okay. Ntabising, perhaps that will be the last question. You go ahead.
Thank you, Chair, and good evening, everyone. Prof, you mentioned that the federal system...
We can't hear you properly. Can you be a bit louder? Sorry.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Chair, for taking my hand. Prof, you mentioned that the federal system of government in Nigeria is unbalanced. And then you also mentioned that the problem is not with the constitutional design, but the implementation of it. So my question is that, according to you, what does it take to implement the constitution of countries to be balanced?
Okay, great. Thank you for your question. I think Nigeria, the Nigeria's federal system is more balanced now than it used to be. It was unbalanced in the past when you had just 3 regions, where one region was larger than the 2 others combined. Today, you have 36 states. Now, there's still some element of imbalance in that, as in many other federations, including South Africa, even Ethiopia, the center seems to be more powerful than the subnational units. But in terms of, so I would talk about imbalance, to use your word, in 2 dimensions: vertical, between the center and the states, and horizontal among the groups in a country. Nigeria today is more balanced because it has 36 states. You don't have this wide inequality between the different units. So I think one way to ensure balance is to ensure that you have multiple states and that no one state is disproportionately bigger than the others, even though they cannot all have equal sizes. In terms of the vertical dimension, I think African federations generally should be looking at how to devolve more powers and resources to the subnational units, rather than concentrating power at the national level, which often invariably is concentrating power in this very imperial, almost monarchical precedent. So that is my question to the issue of balance. With regard to the other side of it, about implementation, I think I've emphasized that you really need to strengthen these oversight institutions that ensure that constitutional principles are actually translated into practice. Things like this, and South Africa has at least from my own experience or reading from a distance, it has a great constitutional court that effectively arbitrates conflicts. Many African countries don't have that. So you need independent institutions that can enforce, that can ensure the implementation of the Constitution. And we can follow this out. And in fact, many Nigerians, in talking about the weakness of oversight institutions in Nigeria, have basically referenced the South African experience as a model where at least institutions, you have independent institutions that show some level of insulation, some level of independence, from the political executive.
Thank you very much. I still see a hand. Okay, so we're gonna push it by, if you don't mind, by another 5 minutes or so. Ben from Kenya has a question. Please go ahead, Ben.
Thank you, Prof. Prof, thank you for the presentation, and sorry I'm asking this so late. I hope it will be very short. My question is about minorities within the states in Nigeria, who can be generally the ethnic communities that do not form majority in those states, but also members of ethnic communities that form majorities in other states, but don't form majority in other states that they may have migrated to. So my question is, do you feel that generally such communities that form minorities within the states are happy with the federal character of the state? Are they happy as it is, or they were probably happier in a more centralized system? Thank you.
Suberu, Rotimi, maybe related to that, my question relates to that. And you have alluded to that in your paper about the indigeneity principle or the indigeneity rule, especially at the state level. And my question is that, so that rule creates sort of first-class and second-class citizens at the state level. And my question is, does that even have a basis in the Constitution? I mean, the reference to indigeneity is with respect to the composition of the national cabinet, but not, I don't think, anywhere else. So does it have a basis in the Constitution? Does it have a basis in the federal character? But also, I think, which is interesting, you mentioned in the paper that the devastating consequences are mitigated by the fact that you can purchase these certificates from the market.
Yeah.
Can you say a few things about that? It could also be interesting for Ben. Thank you.
Yeah. Great. Thank you for those two great questions. I think you are right. There are minorities within the states, and obviously they are not very happy. And the expression of unhappiness is that it's amazing. In Nigeria, we say we have too many states, but you still find these agitations for more states by minorities which feel marginalized within their current communities. So that has been, to me, that would be the expression of the unhappiness. At the same time, there's also these mechanisms that ensure that some of these minorities are represented. For example, if a state is divided in Nigeria into 3 senatorial districts, in some of the states, the minorities are at least big enough to control a senatorial district or to have a House of Representatives seat at the national level. So that accommodates them. Also in Nigeria, the same rule that applies at the national level applies at the subnational level, in that the governor has to win support in 1/4 of the votes in 2/3 of the local governments. So there is a kind of incentive built into the system to, in a way, ensure that these minorities are not completely abandoned or neglected. But in general, they are not happy. They will want a state of their own. And I think the only solution, again, it goes back to this indirect mechanism. The only way to effectively protect minorities within minorities, or minorities at the subnational level, is that you have this constitutional protection that ensures that their basic human rights are not violated, So that will be the long-term ultimate solution. But yes, you are right, these minorities, even though there are some mitigating factors that help to protect them, don't feel adequately protected, and they will want states of their own. They want new states created, which would be ridiculous. There's this joke in Nigeria that we are supposed to have at least 200 ethnic groups, that if you should allow it, each ethnic group will want to have a state of its own, which will create 200 states, which will be ridiculous, So, I hope that answers your question. Regarding the indigeneity rule, yes, that is a major challenge in Nigeria. And in the paper, I note that it is being circumvented by other, by other factors. One, it is not usually applied to the distribution of socioeconomic facilities. Discrimination doesn't take place on that basis. I think another factor is that, as you noted, the principle is actually referred to with respect to, as you rightly noted, the appointment of the president's cabinet. But then it is widely accepted. I think it's widely accepted in Nigeria and in many other African countries that there's this notion of autochtony, people who are sons of the soil, who belong to the soil. So in Nigeria, even though constitutionally you could say there's really no basis for that kind of practice, it is widely accepted and look. And I think, there's this example that is often cited in Nigeria to show how people have this attachment to their place of indigeneity rather than their place of residence. When somebody who has lived in a part of the country that is not their own indigenous area for a long time, when they die, there's almost this cultural commitment to taking them back to it may be a place where they've never been to really, but so they take them to that place for burial, And so there's this notion of indigeneity that is really strongly entrenched in Nigeria, and which, so to me, that has mitigated some of the fact that it is used only in certain aspects of politics. It is not used in socioeconomic distribution. And as you noted, the fact that somebody who has stayed in a place for a long time can find a way to circumvent the rule by maybe adopting a name of that area, or by actually just buying, by buying a certificate of indigenship, So all of those factors, in my view, has mitigated the disruptive or the debilitating effects of the indigeneity rule in Nigeria.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for a very, I think, interesting presentation. And I think, and thank you everybody for this rich discussion. And thank you, Rotimi, for your for giving us generous time to discuss this. And I hope we will continue this conversation in some other ways. Thank you very much.
Yeah, my pleasure. I've enjoyed the discussion too. Thank you for inviting me. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, bye-bye, everyone. Yeah,
and thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Rotimi, and thank you, Yonatan.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.